Okay. Good evening, viewers and friends of MIT. Welcome to our first webinar of 2021. Kicking off a fireside chat with our friends from EDBI, IMDA, and SGInnovate. This time, we're going to talk about navigating and leveraging Singapore's various agencies and deep tech ecosystem. My name is Ching Fu, Vice President of the MIT Club of Singapore. So, ladies and gentlemen, I am delighted to welcome our three distinguished guests. Hopefully, you might have read the illustrious bios. It is so long that I had to print out something and read some of them so that I do justice to their background. First is Dr. Basil from EDBI. Basil is the Managing Partner, Investments at EDBI. He leads the organization's emerging technology team to make strategic investments into emerging smart and sustainable deep tech areas such as mobility, advanced manufacturing, future of computing, blockchain, AR, VR, and agri-food tech. Wow, a mouthful, right? But I've known Basil casually for a while now, and he's really an engineer at heart, a tinkerer with cutting-edge technologies. In fact, if you don't mind me sharing, Basil actually has a solar farm in his home. Is self-sustaining, and in fact, he sells the excess capacity back into the grid. And he also is one of the early adopters of crypto mining. So he holds a BA in mechanical engineering and a PhD from University of Cambridge. There you go. Okay. Secondly is Second is Howie from IMDA. Howie is the Assistant Chief Executive, Media and Innovation Group at IMDA, with oversight of developing the technology, telecommunications, and media business in Singapore, as well as technology capability developments. He is quite unique in that he came from the commercial part of the fence into IMDA. So he was previously the CMO and head of consumer business at StarHub, vice president of corporate development and Lenovo, amongst other roles. In fact, I've been a distant admirer of Howie in his capacity as previous president of the Singapore Computer Society, where he's one of the most engaging and humorous presenters in the local speaking circuit. So if you've not heard him, or if you would like someone to speak for you, he's your man. He also sits at the Science Center Singapore Board, Singapore Pools Technology Advisory Board, and is a graduate of NUS. Finally, but certainly not the least, is Dr. Jui Lim from SGInnovate. Jui is the CEO of the organization, and he is a real medical doctor, unlike Basil. Sorry. And whilst he trained in medicine, Jui has spent most of his professional life in the business of science and innovations. For example, he was a CEO of NTU ETIF and Director of Investments at BioOne Capital, CEO of Merlin MD, a medical device company, Executive Director of the Medical Engineering Research and Commercialization Initiative at NUS, and also Program Director of the Singapore Stanford Biodesign Program, a joint venture between Asst, EDBI, and Stanford. There you go. A bunch of really credible and illustrious people to share with you their wisdom in how to navigate the local deep tech ecosystem. A couple of housekeepings. Please feel free to type in your questions during the discussion, and or alternatively, you can ask the questions at the end of the session. And to facilitate the fireside chat, please welcome Shannon from our Exco, who is in the venture business. Over to you, Shannon.
My bio was really short, Shing-Su. Maybe that's a reflection of my achievements relative to the illustrious panel we have in front of us today. So thank you. Gentlemen, it's really lovely to have you on this call, and thanks to all the Beavers and friends of MIT joining us today. I'm very excited about this conversation. I feel like I've danced around a lot of Singapore Inc. in many ways, these agencies, and trying to understand better how to navigate. And as Ching-Su was saying, I've sort of had this practitioner standpoint from a venture investor side, but also as an operator previously when looking to raise capital and trying to work with some of these agencies as well. I mean, with that, it can sometimes be hard to navigate all these organizations. So perhaps just for a quick moment, 30 seconds to a minute each, could you please just summarize what your agency does? And we'll start with Basil, please.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, just bear with me because I have a slight migraine today, so probably not in top notch. But yeah, so for EDBI, we are the strategic investment arm of the Economic Development Board of Singapore. So while our parent company has been, for the last 50 years attracting, multinational corporations to set up shop in Singapore, EDBI, the investment arm, it was set up about almost more than 30 years ago. Initially as more of a passive holding company to, hold on to strategic equity investments into certain large companies. But we evolved and became active because we needed to compete, with other similar kind of economic development boards around the world. So we moved up the value chain, and we decided that it's quite important to attract and develop capabilities to Singapore, and hence have an investment arm that actively invests in growth stage startups. So that's the sweet spot. These startups have already developed and rolled out their technologies in their home ground and are looking to expand internationally. And so that's when their C-suite would be, primed to think about, especially when expanding into Southeast Asia and Asia. That's when we will pitch to these startups around the world, say, why don't you consider Singapore as your landing ground to expand into Southeast Asia and Asia? So that's what we do. In a nutshell, high level. We have teams as what Ching-Su mentioned. I look in emerging tech, so it'll be all the deep tech, but we do have other teams. We have Infocomms Technologies, and they look into software and all the relevant, enterprise software platforms that would be relevant to Singapore. They'll also be bringing these technologies in. Of course, we have a healthcare team, and then healthcare is also synonymous with deep tech. Those are the geniuses, and then we also have a strategic growth program that's more inside out. So the first three teams that we mentioned, these are the teams that look globally and bring capabilities to Singapore. We also have a team that looks inside out. They identify local companies that have the potential to become regional or global champions, and then we work very closely with Enterprise Singapore, which is our sister agency. We are both under the Ministry of Trade and Industry, to ensure that these local companies become champions.
Fantastic.
So, yep, I'll hand it over to the next.
Thank you, Basil. Let's go to Howie, please.
Sure. Hey, maybe I'll just start by saying that the Singapore on a broad base has an aspiration to be one of the leading digital economies globally, where every business is a digital business, every worker is digitally enriched or empowered, and our lives enriched as well. So aligned with that vision, we see our vision, our role as an architect to try and put the pieces together. And broadly, there are 5 big buckets of things that we do. One bucket is what we call sectoral transformation, which is working with the other sectors, whether it's the financial sector, whether it's the retail sector, the pharmaceutical, the wholesale, with their digital transformation. There's a group that I'm involved in on industry development, which is basically working with the tech, telco, media companies for their growth, because without a strong vertical, it's difficult to enable sectoral transformation. The third group looks at infrastructure, things like 5G. Prior to 5G, we looked at fiber broadband, for example. So some of you may have read the news, I think it was yesterday, that we announced an additional $30 million grant to spur 5G innovation. So, so if you're familiar with Singapore, you think of LTA as the guys who do the roads. We're the guy that does the digital roads. So 5G is the flavor right now. The fourth role we play is what we call digital inclusion. We're only 5.5 million people here, so it's important that we leave no one behind. So whether you're silvers, whether it's the low-income family or young children, we want to make sure that tech becomes available for the larger ecosystem. So that's the digital inclusion group. And then the last role we play is probably what most people remember us for, which is the regulatory role. Whether it's regulating spectrum, whether it's content, whether it's postal, we play a regulatory role. So kind of unique compared to some other countries where the regulator is separated from the industry development. In Singapore, because it makes sense to put everyone in the same house. So that's a bit of who we are.
Thank you, Howie. We'll come back to some of those points in later questions, actually. Let's go to Jui. Thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jui. First of all, let me apologize for being very poorly lit. I just moved into a new place and I'm working off a table in a cupboard. Okay, so SGInnovate is a company that's wholly owned by the Singapore government, and we function like a VC plus plus. And what does that mean? Plus plus. So we're a venture capital fund that's supported by a talent team as well as a community team. And our mandate is to both develop as well as to promote the deep tech sector in Singapore. Let me then also very quickly deal with the elephant in the room. What is deep tech? So by our definition, deep tech is any technology that demands a very high degree of specialization, both by the inventor as well as its eventual practitioners. So that would include anything from AI, quantum, to healthcare, the latest generation vaccines, biologics, advanced manufacturing. So we began life in 2016. Our principal focus in its initial years was in digital deep tech, but moving forward, we're going to start doing more and more in the areas of advanced manufacturing, food and agri, as well as biomedical. We, unlike Basil, whose company EDBI invests at the growth stage, we are investors at the early stage. And most of the time they need to be Singapore-based companies.
Fantastic. That was very clear. I appreciate the time taken to explain what each of your businesses and agencies do. One of the things I want to talk about a little bit, and this is something that we came up in discussion even today when I was at lunch with a private equity investor who's been in Singapore for 30 years, done lots of transactions, knows the market very well. But what we were talking about is just this routing of transactions or opportunities or even investments between the different agencies, and that coordination layer that happens either formally or informally. So when you're on the outside looking in, how do you actually navigate that? And I think, Howie, we spoke previously about an interesting aspect of this through formal communication channels. Maybe you could just tell us a little bit about how that works in your industry with some of the people around the table.
Sure. I think if you wind back, say 20 years ago, tech was a vertical industry. And you had a couple of big companies and government agencies that would have a mainframe somewhere, and tech wasn't as pervasive. So life was a lot simpler then. So you have singular agencies looking after tech. But tech now obviously has become almost everything that we know. And it inevitably cuts across every other sector and across every other government agencies. So 2 years ago, there was a new structure formed called the Digital Industry Singapore, which was basically a combination of teams from EDB, from Enterprise Singapore, as well as IMDA, to come together to form an account management team for the key companies, so that it's a lot easier for the companies to figure out the matrix and the different connections and the different programs and the different routes to take. So that program has seen good success because it's definitely made that connecting the dots in a more formal structure useful. But having said that, we do recognize that that structure can only work for perhaps X number of companies. But there's quite a fair bit of informal connections as well, because the fact that, we have Basil, Jui, and myself, on a regular basis, our organizations speak quite regularly as well, because when we do have a particular opportunity with a particular company we need to work with, kind of everyone's a phone call away. And even for someone who's relatively new to the government system, like myself, I found it very easy from an internal side to say, look into within the directory and figure out, who's the chaps that we need to connect with, so that hopefully we make it easier for the industry.
Got it. And so maybe Basil, you can comment on this, because one of the things is, again, if you're somebody in our audience today, we have some very, very illustrious people in the industry, in the audience, who are very smart, know the sector, understand deep tech. If they came to you with an idea that may or may not fit your mandate, or doesn't fit your mandate, would you just informally pass them along, or how does that recommendation work from your perspective?
Yeah. I mean, a quick answer is yes. It will be informal in the first case, because frankly, Singapore is the way it's structured. You can land on any agency, and most people, if not all, would be able to figure out whether this would land in their bucket or their mandate. If not, it will be quickly referred to the relevant agency. So if I come to a very early stage deep tech company, I would immediately pick up the phone, talk to Jui, and say, hey, are you guys looking at this company? Yeah, they kind of put it on my doorstep. Yeah. And then if it's a growth stage company that has significant revenues, but hopefully less than 100 million, then I'll quickly pick up the phone. I'll talk to Howie and say, hey, these guys have relevant technologies for Singapore, and all the government agencies, maybe they could be accredited, and then they can go into a fast track system to benefit all the government agencies. And then that's where Howie will pick it up.
Got it. I mean, and I think that's great, because I think that personal connectivity is important to kind of lend credibility to any of the opportunities that come past. One of the things that we were talking about, and Jui, maybe you can comment on this, is you've got this incredible experience in the private sector as well as the academics, and now in sort of public sector through SGInnovate as well. Just wanted to understand, where do you see the opportunities for improvement, if any, so that people on the outside, again, can navigate better in the future?
Yeah, I think, in general, and this may reflect my own bias, having spent a little bit of time at EDBI as well. But I think if your first port of call, if you call EDB, it can rarely go wrong. Yeah. However, I do agree. I see your point. As a newcomer, it is bewildering, because every agency now has its own programs. They some invest, some don't, some provide grants, some don't. So it can be bewildering. I think, and I don't know how Howie feels about this. We can do, we've done so much as a result of the pandemic in digitalizing a variety of services. I think the directory, I think it's a good time to take a look at a smarter directory that can help direct people to the different parties. I don't know, Howie, what do you think?
Yeah, so I think while there is some semblance of a formal structure and good examples of informal connectivity, I'm not totally on the same page as you, because I receive an equal amount of feedback that, hey, your officer has been very helpful in connecting the dots, with an equal number of hey, I just got an email that says this is not within your jurisdiction, and it went quiet. So I think part of it is that there is still an opportunity for us to get better, whether it's in the form of a directory or sometimes less is more, simplify the ways of based on use cases that folks can reach to us. But until we get there, I think that's where there's still a lot of work to make sure that at least within IMDA, I'm sure it's the same for SGInnovate and EDBI, just to familiarize the teams with the work that is being done by the larger ecosystem, and to encourage the behavior that says, hey, look, if it falls with you, but if you're not a catcher, don't just refer to another email, but try and walk the journey at least some parts of the way. But Jui, you're right in that maybe this is something that we do need to put a bit more collective effort, perhaps starting with just SGInnovate, EDBI, and IMDA.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You know, Chanel, I mean, as you know, we had a pre-meeting before this session, and you know, I was describing, a technology which. So prior to this, I mean, for the audience, I ran a tech transfer office, and you know, I had very close relations with my counterparts in Israel. And you know, one of the problems with tech transfer offices is, you know, each university can have thousands of researchers working on a multitude of projects, and you know, someone from industry will come in and say, "Hey, show me what you have in advanced manufacturing," and that's, you know, entirely meaningless kind of question, but it happens all the time. So there is an Israeli company that developed a system that sort of trolls the public space, so that if you typed in at the university, you know, I'm interested in, let's say, mRNA, then everyone who's working on mRNA in that university is extracted. Every publication, every patent, every bit of news flow about that professor and their linkages is then produced, and that helps you to identify who you want to work with. And I was thinking that, you know, that could be useful in our ecosystem. Obviously, very, very different universes, but I agree. I think there is room to improve, but take heart. By and large, if you reach out to one of the three organizations here today, we will help.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Like, I've always had good experiences. It's just, I guess the observation is sometimes it takes time to get to the right person because you're trying to work that system, right? But no doubt everyone that I've encountered and worked with, and this is some feedback I've had from others, they've always been positively surprised as to the proactivity of those individuals that we connect with, right? So I think that talks to the culture. I think Howie mentioned that a moment ago about how people go up, you know, sort of walk that journey with them, right? So I think that makes sense. You know, with the audience, we have obviously people who are maybe practitioners in the deep tech space. One of the things we look at and we want to understand a bit better is where in that deep tech spectrum is the most amount of interest, focus, capital from the context of a regional competitive landscape going in Singapore. I'd love to ask Howie to perhaps address this, because we talked about 5G and being very targeted as to how that capital, for example, would be allocated in that space, or how we'd look at that. But maybe I'd like to also get Basil and Jui to sort of comment on that after as well. So maybe Howie, if you could give us some perspective on where you see the spend and the interest and the talent going today.
Well, I think just specifically on 5G, there is a very strong recognition that, well, 5G is inevitable. Everyone's trying to figure out how to monetize 5G, because any use case for it to be sustainable, the monetization part has to be the clear line of sight. So when we looked at the whole ecosystem, we said, I think it's clear that, you know, we won't lead in the 5G hardware space because we don't have companies in Singapore that does this space. We won't lead in the 5G software space per se. But as we looked across, given the jobs to be done today by most businesses is finding that innovation that is monetizable for sustainability, then what we said is that let's be helpful, because the value that Singapore could bring is to create the necessary infrastructure and ecosystem for some of this innovation to be done easier here, easily out of Singapore, so that potentially it can be replicated. Obviously, the value for Singapore thereafter is that if the innovation is done in Singapore, then hopefully some of the value capture can stay in Singapore as it gets expanded out. So last year we said, okay, let's put a $40 million grant out to invite companies to come and try and do some of their innovations. And then yesterday we announced an additional 30 million because the interest was so high. Separately, we've announced a free use space at Pixel Labs, which is at One North, for companies to want to use the 5G infrastructure to test fit their apps or their software. And we've made an announcement. It was a bit quiet, but we made an announcement of doing a 5G academy to train skills ahead of time as well. So we kind of know that 5G is inevitable. There are certain spaces like hardware and the core technology that we will not be able to really value add. But where we can value add is building an ecosystem where the next bound of innovation of applications that is monetizable for sustainability. Hopefully to invite companies to try it out and do it out of Singapore.
And so it's sort of incentivizing people to set up that R&D, that sort of innovation team here. And it's sort of the high value add portion of all this basically is where we're going. When I look at the portfolio, Basil, that you've invested in, it's actually quite broad, right? In terms of the types of companies that you focused on and invested in. Is that by design, by accident? It's opportunistic across all these different areas of deep tech, let's call it?
A combination of both. So the structured approach was we look at both the supply and demand side. Supply side is, you know, for instance, we'll take reference to what the National Research Foundation's plans are. So if you go to their website, you see that they have bucketed into, you know, roughly 4 buckets: advanced manufacturing, HBMS, which is healthcare biomedical sciences. They'll look at SDE, which is digital services and software, and they'll also look into USS, which is urban solutions and sustainability. So those are the types of R&D money that's being poured into these areas. And if you really drill down into each bucket, there will be deep tech elements in them. And then at the same time, on the demand side, in Singapore, it's called, there are about 6 industry transformation roadmaps, ITMs, we call them. And so these 6, maybe I'll just rattle them off to you. Manufacturing ITM, modern services ITM, trade and connectivity, lifestyle, essential domestic services, and built environment. And then if you drill down into these 6 clusters, you find that they are all addressed to various government organizations. So manufacturing will be under EDBI, modern services will be, because there's finance in it, there'll be MAS, there's also IMDA involved, there's software, and the list goes on. Trade and connectivity would be the Land Transport Authority, the Civil Aviation Authority of Singapore. So maybe I could illustrate it with an example. So after looking at the supply side and also the demand side, so we zoomed in on, for example, driverless vehicles, driverless technologies, because more than 20 years ago, there was a lot of investment into the Singapore MIT Alliance for Research and Technology, SMART, right? Of which, for example, Eugene Fitzgerald came from. So SMART established 20 years ago. They brought in professors from MIT to teach all our postdocs and our students all about autonomous technologies. And so it didn't happen by chance. Capabilities were being built 20 years ago, even when AV or driverless vehicle technologies wasn't even a buzzword. And then at the same time, we had to, EDBI being whole of government, we spoke to the Ministry of Transport, we spoke to LTA, we spoke to CAS, say, what's your technology roadmap? What does Singapore want, right? What's its vision? And then the comment was, well, we really need to reduce the number of cars in the road. The roads in Singapore taking up 12% of our land mass. It can't go on forever. We think that driverless vehicle technologies is the way to go. And that led us to invest in, we looked around, we invested in this company called Newtonomy, small check size, but they were actually already looking at Singapore because of the capabilities started up by SMART, right? The Singapore MIT Alliance for Research Technologies. So they felt that instead of competing with all the Silicon Valley salaries and everything, and the capabilities built up in Singapore was good, they decided to expand to Singapore, right? And that really, from that investment, Newtonomy was first to launch a driverless vehicle taxi. They beat Uber to it by 1 week. It put Singapore on the map. So that kind of attracted all the other auto OEMs to Singapore to do all the testing, test bidding. And then, Newtonomy got acquired by Delphi, Aptiv, which further deep-rooted a key account in Singapore, generated even more jobs for Singaporeans. And then the last we heard, that got Hyundai's attention. So now Hyundai is entering into a joint venture with Aptiv. They're calling this new entity Motional. And guess what? The same CEO and COO of Newtonomy are now the CEO and COO of Motional. And they have, in the last count, it's almost 200 full-time employees hired in Singapore to do very high-value R&D. So these are the things that we look out for, and we wish for more of these things to happen in a structured manner. So this is an example of us looking into the transport cluster and seeing what is required.
Yeah, I mean, that's an incredible outcome, right? From a top-down, bottom-up perspective, it all has worked out really well.
And from a single-digit check size, it ended up with almost a $6 billion JV with between Hyundai and Aptiv, right? Creating lots of very high-value jobs, for Singaporeans based in Singapore.
Yeah, that's really awesome. And Jui, what's your perspective of this when you look at your portfolio at SGInnovate? You talked about VC++. By the way, if anyone's on this call and hasn't signed up to SGInnovate's newsletter and training programs, do, because they're actually a very, very active events calendar and schedule, which by the way, I love. So thank you for that and that contribution.
Thank you. We operate in a strange space because we're really looking at frontier technologies and trying to get position in them. So we were early investors in fact, all of the quantum spin-offs from the universities here. We were the first investors in a company called Bioformis, which is a pioneer in software as a medical device. It's a whole new category by the FDA. We try to be, in the army, we have this group, they are known as long range reconnaissance patrols. That's what we're like, right? We're looking beyond just at the horizon or just beyond. And we're making early bets. And, ultimately we're measured on how accurate those bets are in terms of how much private sector capital we've catalyzed. So, for instance, we've deployed about 50 million, and that's led to about an additional 700 million in private sector investment in our portfolio companies. But having said that, we take some reference, just as Basil does, just as EDBI does, from also the national agenda. So moving ahead, for instance, we're going to be, we did digital in the first phase. Now we're going to move into advanced manufacturing, biomedical, and agri-food. What we've also seen, since part of your question was where we see the demand coming, as a result, one of the few positives of the pandemic has been a resurgence of interest in deep tech. I mean, people used to be very scared to invest in early stage deep tech. Now we have investors, people from family offices speaking to us. We want to position. We want to make sure that, we want to position when disease X shows up. So we're seeing interest not just in certain themes, but also in stages. It seems like interest is moving upstream.
Actually, that brings us to the next question. That's very helpful because I guess there's something you said there which I thought was interesting. It's like sounded like one of your mandates was this idea of catalyzing private sector investment into these companies. Is that like a clear mandate? Like, do you have it set as one of the objectives, or how do you think about the objectives between investment, education, employment?
Well, we have a whole bunch of reportable objectives, and then this is one of them.
Okay,
Yeah.
Got it. And any take more priority than others? I think employment's obviously important for all these agencies, but
yeah. No, I don't think it's the alpha and the omega of our existence. I think equally important is what we do on the talent side. So, I mean, you've alluded to the fact that we, run a lot of programs, a lot of events. So the events do a couple of things for us. I mean, one is, of course, it promotes Singapore's role in deep tech. But equally important, we want to educate. And from these programs, we also get information on the registrants. Now, on an opt-in basis, people can then choose to opt into our talent program. If they raise their hands and say, I'd like to be considered for employment opportunities, they then get shunted into our talent database. So we place people within our portfolio. But since I've come on board in May, what I've decided to do is I'm going to open up this database so we're going to help place people in EDBI's portfolios, IMDA's portfolios. We're starting with government-linked agencies first, but the idea is we have one of the most extensive talent databases in Singapore. I want to make it useful across the board, even to the private sector eventually. So that's how it all connects.
That's actually really interesting. I mean, especially for the people listening on this call, the MIT alum and the graduates, things like that's quite powerful. Trying to go through a recruitment agent looking for a deep tech role in a random company is actually very hard because they just don't have the expertise or the credibility. So working through an organization like yours, very powerful. And I think getting to know people and getting to understand how that can be leveraged is so useful.
Look, for all the MIT graduates out there, I mean, you're exactly the kind of graduates we're looking for. If you have any interest at all, please, Chanel and Ching Su will be very happy to connect you with us, and we'll stick you into our database. And as and when the opportunity, we'll try to match you because our portfolio is exclusively deep tech. Now, having said that, we are at that level where we're looking for good technical specialists. We're not a C-suite kind of, we don't do C-suite work, although that's something we're thinking of, at least in early stage companies. What we do, however, is we run training programs for startup leaders. And we're going to ramp that up over the next few years because there's so many, I think at MIT, you're familiar. I mean, if you're one of Bob Langer's graduates, I mean, it's par for the course, right? If you're a good graduate student, you'll take a technology, you'll start a company. It's not so common here. So we actually need to spend a bit of time, coaching our startup leaders.
That's great.
Anyway, feel free to reach out to us. Yeah.
Thank you. I think that's a really great offer. And I hope people do take you up on that because one of the key objectives of this call is exactly this, right? To navigate how to make the most of what we have in front of us in terms of the agencies and the network. So thank you.
I should add, let me just take this opportunity to just add that one of our portfolio companies is an accelerator called Entrepreneur First. Yeah. I'm not sure if you're aware of that, Chanel.
I didn't know it was a portfolio company. Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe portfolio is wrong. We invested in them. So they're a London-based accelerator. And what they do is they build companies around talent, not ideas. It's quite interesting. So if you, and I think this is especially relevant for MIT graduates, if you're trained in a deep tech space and you want to start a company, but you don't quite know what you want to do, look us up. Again, go to EF. What they do then is they then pair you up with the other applicants and then you work on something. Now, the premise seems unusual, but we've had some quite incredible successes coming out of EF.
That's great. Thank you for that. When we look at the other entities, like EDBI, I mean, Basil, you've mentioned previously that there is a let's not call it a quid pro quo, but an understanding that you want these companies to build a base in Singapore, develop that talent pool here. How do you think about your competing interests? Is it a financial return relative versus a employment mandate? I mean, they kind of all work together, I understand that, but how do you think about it?
Yeah, so we have the challenging task of being dual mandate. We draw funds from the Ministry of Finance. So there is a minimum hurdle rate that we have to meet. But just as importantly, we have these strategic mandates from the Ministry of Trade and Industry that we have to meet. Value add per worker, percentage of skilled jobs versus industry average, amount of investments. These are developmental objectives. Total business spend versus the investment. So if you put in $1, but it ends up the company spending $4, and pumping it right into Singapore's economy, great. Yeah. So it's not just return on investment per se. That's the big picture. So we, while there are other funds that just focus purely on financial returns, and rightly so. So we have the GIC St. Temasics of the world. They're supposed to increase our reserves, so that's what they're focused on. Our focus is really on creating meaningful capabilities and meaningful jobs for Singaporeans. And I think it goes hand in hand. Deep tech is definitely an interesting area where the job that will be created will be very high value, right? And the capabilities would be like super high barriers to entry. So that's definitely an area that we will continue to focus on.
Yeah. That's helpful. I mean, and I guess, Howie, you have a kind of different type of mandate in that sense because of the regulatory nature of IMDA, right? When you think about your priorities between, you talked about the 5 elements, but I suppose let's call it sector development versus regulation. You're trying to kind of move forward with one pedal and brake with another, right? How does that balance work?
Well, I think your analogy is spot on because it's like a car. You need an accelerator, you need a brake.
Yeah.
And I think that's the balance is I think will be situational and by project. Because I'll just take an example called data. Because when we look at data, we don't look at data purely from a regulatory standpoint in terms of data protection and privacy per se, but looking at data protection with an eye of data innovation. Because at the end of the day, we do recognize that for data to be valuable, the innovation needs to be able to come into a stage where it is used on a sustainable level. So I think that's the benefit of having both the regulatory as well as the industry development, because internally we have to work it out. Internally, we have to find the right lever. And often it's a series of experimentations that we have to take 2 steps forward, calibrate where is it headed, and then readjust from there. So a bit like what Basil was saying, we have to be a bit focused on 2 centers of gravity. One on what makes sense for Singapore's industry as part of our larger vision for digital economy. And yet the other lens is how do we make sure that there's sufficient protection as well?
Yeah, understood.
So there's no measurement that says you have to be 5% on protection and 5% on industry development. So
right.
We try and keep our debates internal so that hopefully what we produce outside makes sense.
Yes, that's right. It's like not always showing your dirty laundry is the way I put it. I want to keep that indoors. Ching Su, that's the end sort of the questions that I have. I'd love to open up the floor for other questions, but maybe Ching Su, you want to wrap up for us, and then we'll open up for questions either in the chat or just directly as people want to unmute and ask the question directly.
I have a question. Our discussions this evening has been very Singapore and domestic centric, obviously, right? We got to take care of our interests. What about for multinationals that are looking to Singapore to invest, but also as a platform to get into the region? What do your agencies and the other ecosystem can do to help facilitate this as part of the value add and attraction for them to use Singapore at least as the springboard, whether it's in terms of your access to sister organizations, cities, access to government officials, and so on.
Maybe I'll just offer a couple of comments first, and then let me get Basil and Jui to share. I think maybe a couple of perspectives. One is on the most basic level. Even though it may not directly relate to your business, the 22, 23 FTAs that is really signed from Singapore across does form a foundation of trade and connectivity for businesses who are based out of Singapore. And basic stuff like banking infrastructure and all this, while invisible, makes it very easy. Because in my previous life in Lenovo, we moved quite a fair bit of infrastructure into Singapore, largely for that reason, because it's predictable here. The infrastructure is in place, and it's easy for me to get things done in Singapore for the region. The other perspective is that when we look at the global companies, in most cases, they have the infrastructure, the know-how to go global. Singapore plays different roles, whether it's from a talent perspective, whether it's from a innovation perspective. I think the group that we do hear quite a fair bit of help required is actually the smaller companies that say, hey, I want to get into Indonesia, I want to get into China. Are there ways that you can help me open a gate, open a door, and then we can follow through? So towards that end, we've done a couple of things like the Shenzhen Agreement and the Chongqing Agreements on the G2G level, but with the intent that while the G2G is being built, it hopefully opens some form of highway or open a little road for B2Bs to happen as well. So there are different pockets. Sister agency Enterprise Singapore has a program called the Global Innovation Alliance, which basically builds jump stations in different countries. So there are different pockets of programs available, but I think it depends on what are the problems and jobs to be done by the companies that you mentioned as well. And usually we use that as a starting point.
Yeah, just to add to what Howie's saying. So we are always very upfront to the growth stage startups that we're trying to attract to Singapore. We always admit to them, hey, look here, Singapore has a small domestic market, but its strengths would be in the financial structure, the legal structure, the intellectual property protection. It's all there. Great place to be a test bed, to do R&D. Talent, thanks to what SGInnovate is doing. There's talent as well. We'll help you match them up. But from there, you can, within a 4-hour flight zone, you have access to 700 million people. The rising demographics of the middle class, and all untapped. So, everyone's viewing Southeast Asia as a high growth region, and they're more than happy to set up their regional headquarters in Singapore, even their global HQ. And we will pitch it to them, say it's win-win. We'll match you up with, the thousands of multinational corporations that our parent company, EDBI, has already attracted over the last 50 years. And should your solution solve their problem statements, and because these MNCs have regional or even global mandates, that scaling up would be tremendous for you as a startup. So that's kind of a very nice value proposition for them, and it also helps our our big accounts. These MNCs are they're also being attracted by tax benefits or whatever grants they can get from competing countries. So if we add value by making Singapore have an ecosystem of very up-to-date, cutting-edge technologies that can solve their problems, these large accounts will continue to stay in Singapore, and continue to hire Singaporeans. So it's a win-win for everyone, and they're all mindful that Singapore is a small domestic market, but they're still setting up shop in Singapore. Yeah.
Maybe as a personal observation, when I set up the Entrepreneurial Finance Labs office, we were looking around Southeast Asia. I used to be based in Jakarta and prior to that, Hong Kong. Singapore became the obvious choice for a few different reasons. One was the level and number of DTAs in place, the double taxation agreements across the region, which made it very attractive. And obviously the talent perspective as well. And I think all of us in this call are pretty fortunate being associated with MIT, all the scholars, the access to individuals who've probably gone to school with. We're very, in my view, very accommodating and positive and supportive in helping us kind of navigate the system when we first arrived. So that's just a personal perspective as well.
Yeah, but if I may just add as well that we're very cognizant that while we have a few positives, there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. As Jui mentioned earlier, we do need to find a way that it's a lot simpler, a lot easier, less complicated. We do need to continue to find ways to be useful, because every other nation is also looking at ways of being valuable to the ecosystem. And in a world that is hyper-connected, where all of us are used to working from home, the potential of having your workforce in a distributed level on a global level is even more possible. So while I think we have a couple of positives, I think none of us are disillusioned to say that we that it's time to lay back, and that's where there's a lot of how should I put it, internal energy put on what else do we need to do, how else we need to up our game as well.
We have a couple of questions from the audience. I'm going to mispronounce this name. Is it Dikle Unzanayala? Would you like to unmute and ask the question directly? Or would you like me to ask? You can put it in the chat or otherwise. Okay, the question is, there's a breadth of fundraising opportunities for early stage deep tech companies, but do you have any resources to highlight, particularly in Singapore? And I guess you mean when you say resources, you want to know like where to go to, is that right? Exactly. So where's your first port of call to understand the resources available for early stage deep tech companies? Where should somebody look at or look to? Maybe SGInnovate, Jui, you'd be the best person to answer this. Mm-hmm.
Well, I would have to say that's probably us. If it's in the themes that we can't do it all because we're not a big company and we're limited by the funds that we have. But like I've said, moving ahead, going forward, the three themes would be food, biomedical, and advanced manufacturing. So if you are interested or you have a company in those areas, look me up as your first port of call.
Thank you. Actually, there's another question for you specifically from Manik Arora. Beyond funding, what are the big challenges some of these deep tech companies are facing here in Singapore?
I think the leadership issues are very real. And that's something we want to spend a bit of time to address. It's one thing if the startup founder is in his 30s or 40s and has worked before, but it's a different thing when we talk about fresh PhDs coming out and starting companies. We've had it's legion. You're more likely to fail because of these issues than because the technology doesn't work. Your best friends can go into business together and end up being mortal enemies. A variety of things, an inability to communicate properly, managing teams. Once you start managing people below you, these are skills that need to be developed rather quickly.
And so that's not a question of that you're not just trying to match them up with somebody who's got that experience. You're saying, hey, look, we can do that matching. That's important, but let's actually train these technical talents in their capabilities themselves as well. Yeah, because most of our founders in our portfolio are technical people in the early stages. Yeah, so rather than matching them with a business person, you're saying, look, we really need these individuals. And you see this in the US a lot because you have a lot of technical founders that are, not necessarily always matched up. They lead by their own. I remember there's a course at MIT, and I forget the course code, that was specifically about managing technology teams, managing conflict between talent organizations, and a lot of the engineering students were taking these courses, which is great, right? I think it's excellent. Well, if we can match them up with a good business person, that would be ideal. The problem is these business people
get frightened by when they look under the covers and they see what's going on. These companies, they're like, oh my God, I mean, I'm not going to commit to a company that's so disorganized or, you know, has no system in place. So now and then, of course, we have, you know, people with the guts to do that. But no, it's not easy. I mean, you got to be attractive to get good people to join you.
So this talent is probably the second biggest question. I mean, funding is obviously always a perennial issue, but like, I hear you. Okay.
Those are the two Achilles heels. Yeah. Potential Achilles heels of our ecosystem.
Shaina, Mark
yes.
asked just a follow up to that question. Is the issue around the talent at the C level, board level, advisory, is it all across the board? Or, you know, obviously it's there at the tech leadership level at the C level, but at the board level also, do you have challenges with mentorship and finding chairmans and, you know, the strategy and things like that?
No, I think at the early stage, you know, I think more and more people are prepared to give their time to interesting startups. I don't think that's an issue. I think, and you know, I also don't want to overblow this as an issue, but certainly, you know, where we are operating at the earlier stages of company formation. And, you know, these are the issues we see with the founders that need to be addressed. Otherwise, they're not going to raise money. They're not going to attract good people into the company or onto their board. You know, these are the things that not particularly special to Singapore. It's just that we have less, you know, we haven't gone through the cycle of death and rebirth as much as people in the US have, for instance. So this is something that we need to address.
Thank you for that. Thanks, Manik, for your question.
Hey, we have run out of time on the dots. With that, I would like to ask if y'all can spend a few minutes to do a quick feedback for us. I've flashed the QR codes on the screen. The URL is also in the chat box. It will help us to design our future events. Having said that, I would like to thank all of you for spending the last hour with us. I hope that you find this interesting and informative. Feel free to contact us or the agencies directly if you think that there are potential collaboration in the future. With that, thank you, Basil, Howie, Jui, and Shanna for this wonderful session. Have a great evening.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you so much, everyone. And thanks to our panelists. Thank you so much.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Bye. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.
Basil.
Bye.
Thanks, Howie.
Bye.
Thank you, Steve. Bye.